Welcome to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast, where we break down the complex and emotional process of divorce into manageable, easy-to-understand steps. I'm your host, Greer Howard, and with me is Bobby Buchanan, widely recognized as one of Illinois' top divorce attorneys, offering unmatched insight and experience in family law. Well, Bobby, we are back today with another, honestly, emotional decision that comes with divorce. And today we're going to be talking about the marital home. And, typically there's kind of three options, I guess, with the marital home. You can either, stay in the home, you're going to sell the home, or you could potentially co-own the home post-divorce. And so today we're going to really kind of break down that both on the financial side and the emotional side, because, your marital home comes with so many emotions. So Bobby, why don't you kind of just start us out today? Why do you think that the marital home, it can be such a sticking point when people are going through a divorce?
Yeah, it really can. Greer, thanks so much for hosting another episode. And I'm excited about this one because it's one of the biggest puzzle pieces that we have to figure out when we do get divorced. Next to the kids, the home is probably the place where a lot of the emotions are tied up in our marriage. Getting, this is the American dream, is to get married, to buy a house, to raise kids. So when we get divorced, figuring out what's going to happen with that house is tough logistically and emotionally. So that's really a big starting place when we start to untangle and do the divorce work.
Yeah. Well, okay. So would you say that the most common option is typically to sell a house?
Yeah, that is going to be the most common option. And when I start talking to people about the divorce process, they call me, they tell me that they're thinking about divorce or they know that they want a divorce. One of the first questions that I ask them is, are you and your wife or are you and your husband still living under the same roof? And if they say yes, I know that we're going to have some work to do to figure out how do we do this. Because not everybody wants to leave the house. Not, the cleanest way, if I could just snap my fingers and my clients do exactly what I ask them to do, which isn't always, because it's not my life, of course, it's theirs, and it's not as easy as that, is to sell the house. Let's sell the house. Let's liquidate it. Let's see what kind of equity we have in it. That's a lot easier to divide than figuring out some other option, figuring out how one person can stay in the house.
Yeah. So, and I feel like on that end, it kind of like if we take the emotion out of it for a minute, that's probably the most practical thing to do because you're able to like just easily, decide, wipe the slate clean and move forward. So let's talk about maybe some of the pros of selling a house, but then also maybe, some of the cons because it's not all easy.
Yeah, it's not all easy. And the pros certainly are financially. Like I said, you get to liquidate this asset, get the money out of it. Usually when you're divorcing, you do need to have some flexibility in your money. So for example, you're going to have to pay attorney's fees. There might be debts. This is a big one. There might be credit card debts. There might be a vehicle notes that you have to pay. You have a loan on your vehicle. Being able to pay all of that off makes things a lot easier. You might have a second mortgage on your house that's hanging over your head, and paying that off opens up a lot of possibilities. So
sure. And also legal fees. You're probably going to, accrue some legal fees obviously over this time. So if you're able to sell the house, that could help with that too.
Yeah, and hopefully we keep those to a minimum as possible. It is possible to get divorced without going into 5 figures of legal fees. But if we do argue over any of these sorts of things, if we have to go into court, if we have to talk to a judge, if we have to, deal with things like evidence and testimony, your legal fees start to rise pretty quickly. So selling the house might become your only option. One of the other big positives that I think as far as selling the house is moving on. I personally know that my wife and I worked so hard to come up with the down payment for our house that we currently live in. It was really a transitional time in our life. We moved into the house with an 18-month-old, and then we had our daughter, and it feels like part of our heart is in that home. So God forbid if anything happened to my family, if we had to move on and separate, which, it's hard to even contemplate those sorts of things. And I'm in that state of mind now where I don't even want to think about divorce. But if we did, it would be so heartbreaking and hard for me to continue living in that house. I would just want to start fresh, start in a new place, a new chapter. So selling your home can be really, I think, healthy from an emotional standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I know from my personal experience of being divorced that when we were going through that process, we owned a home, and I just couldn't imagine being able to kind of restart my life like with new memories. And we had a young son, so I felt like I could create some new memories somewhere else with him. But it just sort of felt like it was going to be too hard to move on by just staying in the same environment. So I understand that. But, in my situation, a lot of situations, there might be one person who wanted to sell the house, which is what I wanted to do. But my ex-husband really wanted to stay in the house. And at the time, I didn't feel like I could afford it. So what do you do when one person wants to sell, but then maybe the other person is hesitant or doesn't want to?
Yeah, if one person does want to sell and the other person doesn't want to, hopefully the person who doesn't want to has some financial options. I mean, it doesn't matter to me personally if I want to sell and the other person doesn't want to sell, as long as they can buy me out and give me what I would get otherwise, then I'm okay with that. But that, there does come some difficulties with that, some challenges, which we could talk about. But really, if you don't have an agreement there, and I see this all the time where, because it's such an emotional process, we lose sight of, practically speaking, what might make sense. Maybe we don't like the idea of the other person staying in the house, and we become kind of hard-headed and we say, well, no, I don't want you to live there. That's our house. And make it more difficult. And then you're caught in this place of litigation, and we end up owing our attorneys a lot of money just because, we have kind of our emotions tied up in the process. So we have to make sure to just be a little bit more practical there if we're not seeing eye to eye.
Well, we talked a little bit about one person potentially wanting to sell the home and the other being hesitant. And there are some cons that can come along with selling a home. So what would some of those be?
Yeah, I mean, for selling the home, I think the biggest con is the instability that comes with it for the kids. I remember when I was a kid and I grew up in the same house. I was actually born in the house that I lived in for 18 years, and I didn't know anything else. And there was a certain point in my childhood where my parents were trying to figure out whether or not they could continue to live there, whether they could afford it, whether they needed to move actually out of my hometown somewhere else. And I remember being so scared and telling my mom, like, please don't move, please don't leave here. As kids, like, that is such a safe place if they have lived in the same house. So moving can not only is the divorce hugely disruptive to children, especially if they're of the ages of 6 to 13, 14 years old, where they really are aware of themselves, but they're really reliant on their parents for emotional growth and whatnot. So I think that by far is the biggest con, is that you're turning the life of your children upside down, potentially.
Yeah, I can understand that. I grew up in the same home from when I was 2. And so it was kind of the same thing. And my parents are in their 70s now. They just downsized. And even as a full grown adult, it was kind of like, oh my gosh, this was our home that we grew up in. So I understand that for sure. And, something that makes me think of that I feel like is, relevant for, home buyers that potentially bought since 2020 when the interest rates were really low. I mean, a con could be, the interest rates, they're a lot higher now. So if you're locked into something lower, wouldn't you say a con would be, okay, well, you're not going to be able to probably afford the same type of home because the interest rates are higher.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to also affect the price that you're going to get for the home. So if you're going to sell it and interest rates are higher, then people might not be willing to pay as much money. You're not going to get as much equity out of the house. And so you really have to look at, where is the market? What are the interest rates at right now? What are the typical home prices for comps, as they call them, other comparable homes, and figure out, is this the right time to actually sell this house? And you do have some options. If you both agree that selling the house is the right way to go, but the market really isn't in the best place, then there's some options to discuss, and we'll talk about that at the last segment. I'd throw that under the co-ownership of the home category, which has its own challenges, but we'll dive into those in a bit.
Sure, sure. And what about, okay, so let's say you do sell the home, you make that decision. What happens with the proceeds? How does that get divided?
Yeah, so the actual nuts and bolts of what we do is, generally speaking, what will happen is that the proceeds will go into an escrow account. Either your attorney or the other attorney will hold that money. And let's say, for example, it's $200,000 is the check that is cut to you, or the both of you, at the title company. In Illinois, all deals are closed usually at the title company, and then the proceeds is wired to wherever they're directed to. So that's going to be the attorney's bank account, not their personal bank account, but a special bank account set up for this sole purpose. They're going to hold the money, and then they'll disperse it. They'll give it out based on the agreement of the parties or the order of the judge. So usually at the end of one of these cases, the attorney is going to their own bank or doing it online and sending a check for $50,000 here, $50,000 there. Maybe sending part of it to pay off attorney's fees for the other side if the case is overly litigated. They'll handle everything with the proceeds.
Yeah. You have to always remember, where all you have to pay off before you're actually getting the money. You've got a lot of fees potentially, so you may not be getting as much as you think or hope. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about if, one spouse does want to keep the home? Can we sort of talk through that of, you've decided that someone from the couple is going to stay in the home and then the other person is going to move out and do something else for housing. What would you say are some of the pros and cons of that choice?
Yeah. So let's talk about first the best case scenario, or the best way to do that. If the spouse that wants to stay in the home is also the spouse that is solely on the mortgage, that is the easiest logistically to do. So, because if they're not, then you're going to have to deal with the refi. If I'm not going to stay in the home and I want to go purchase another home, that's going to be almost impossible to do unless I make a very good income if I already have another mortgage in my name. So if both of our names are on that mortgage, the spouse who wants to stay in the home has to refi it and get their own mortgage to take over that marital mortgage, if you will. So I always like to look at the scenario where one spouse stays in the home if that is the spouse who's on the mortgage. That's the easiest way to do it.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really important thing that, to be honest, I don't think I had fully thought through. So you're saying if out of the couple, you are the person with the name on the mortgage, that's going to be easy to do. If both of you are on the mortgage, you still have to refinance, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You can't just put into the divorce agreement, okay, spouse A who wants to stay in the house is going to be responsible for the mortgage and they're going to pay the mortgage. That's great, but that's only half of it. You,
Mm.
spouse B, you're still on the mortgage. As far as the bank is concerned, you still owe that money. And if spouse A doesn't pay the mortgage, they're going to be trying to foreclose the house and they're going to try to sue both of
And
you
that affects
to
you.
get the money that they're owed. So we got to get you off the mortgage if the other spouse plans to stay there.
And if, for instance, let's say the husband is the only name on the mortgage, but the wife wants to keep the home, then you would again have to refinance because she would need to then have her name on the mortgage and not him. So I just think this is really important information for people to know of what's like realistic, honestly, of kind of looking up that information, making sure you know that information, because it may, if you're not even on the mortgage, or if you are on the mortgage and have to come off of the mortgage, again, it may make more sense just to go ahead and cut ties and do something else.
Yeah, and get it. This is so important because being practical and knowing what the actual options are is going to save you so much time. It's like you can just get down to brass tacks and know, okay, I might want to stay in this house, but it's not legally or financially possible. And one of the things that you can do, simplest things, and I tell people to do this all the time when they say, oh, I'd like to stay in the house, is, well, you should go talk to a mortgage broker because, they can put it through their calculators. They'll ask you what your income is, what other debts you might have, and figure out whether or not you could actually be eligible for that sort of loan that you're going to have to get, because you're going to have to get money. Not only are you going to have to get a loan that will pay for the house, but enough that a bank might give you cash out of it as well, so you can pay off the other spouse. So figure out the answer to that before you decide, I want to stay in this house.
Right. I mean, again, if you're able to take some of that emotion out, just understanding what is practical, what makes sense, what you're able to afford moving forward is just so important. And then, gosh, it's such a great point. I don't know why I had never even really thought about that before, but it just makes me think of it so differently. So this is a really great point. But hey, let's say that somebody really does want to stay in the home. So let's talk through some of those pros of, maybe going through those hoops and figuring it out because you really do want to stay in the home.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is the flip side of selling the house, and that is you're providing the stability for the kids. I'm blessed to live across the street from a park where my kids' kindergarten through 8th grade is. And so being able to keep that for them is something that I would think very, very strongly about. So that's one. The second one is the potential for financial gain and being able to keep the interest rate that you do have for your house, especially if your name, and this is again, if your name is the one on the mortgage and you don't have to refi. Because once you refi, you don't get to keep that 2.5 or 3.1 interest rate that you might have gotten. You're going to get bumped into whatever the current interest rate.
We're in the market rate.
Yeah. Exactly.
Higher than that right now when we're recording.
And, when it comes to the emotional side, yes, going into the new home or selling and then, starting a new chapter somewhere else can be great for us rip the Band-Aid off types, but it might not be the best for some of us who are a little bit more sentimental or nostalgic or don't handle sudden change as well. Like, I'm not here to say my way is the best way personally. That's just how I would want to do it. Maybe for you, it is better for your own mental health to stay in that house for a bit, to grieve the loss of your marriage and figure out different timing for moving on. I would just caution people to really look at the financial cost of that decision. Like some people just hang on for dear life for that home. And it makes it so they put their blinders on. They end up spending all this money litigating to stay in that home. It's not even a good investment to stay in the home. And they do it just because of the sentimental value, and it costs them dearly as far as moving on with their life. So just be careful with that one.
Yeah, and why don't we just get really clear on, a couple of those cons? Like we've sort of talked about a few, but if you could list off a couple of just to not forget that these could be a few negatives of being the one to keep the house.
Yeah, I mean, keeping the house, it's one thing to have a house when you have two people under that roof. You probably have two incomes. Expenses get a lot greater when you're living on your own. You're not splitting everything. You tend to things become more expensive. So carrying the mortgage and paying the property taxes and the maintenance and the upkeep and having that, it can become very stressful. So I think people really need to consider whether or not they might have to downsize. Most people, from a financial perspective, probably should downsize. I mean, even if you're a six-figure earner, you make a good amount of money, it probably still makes sense to downsize, especially in this transition period. Don't just keep the house for sentimental reasons. I would say the only the biggest reason is just for the kids. Like if it's good for the kids, then really think about it. But don't do it for your own emotional, sentimental reasons unless you really have to.
That's really good advice. So, okay, so I'm going to think through for myself some of the things that you should ask yourself before deciding to stay in the marital home, and you add on here. I mean, one, I think the point that you said about who is on the title is I'm sorry, who is on the mortgage is huge because if you're on the mortgage, that makes it easier. If not, you're going to have some challenges. Also, if you're able to take some of the emotion out, what's practical financially for you, but then, but not considering the emotions because there are, potentially some emotional value, specifically if there are kids. So what am I missing here, Bobby?
I mean, I think you did a pretty good job of naming the big things, really thinking about, am I wanting to stay in this home for reasons that don't make practical sense? Is this, if I look at this decision 2 years from now, am I going to be happy that I tried to move heaven and earth in order to stay in this home? It might be, if it's a house that is really unique or is in a place that you see the value of it going up significantly, maybe your purpose is to keep this house and to give it to your own children. You have to it's got to be something bigger than yourself, is the reason that you're wanting to stay in this house. Don't get caught up in this house. Unfortunately, and it's incredibly sad, but your marriage is ending. This chapter of your life is ending. This identity that you had is ending. It is a sort of death, and to grieve that is okay. But, don't just hold on to this house and cost yourself dearly financially because of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really good advice, Bobby. Okay. So now we're going to talk about another option, which is co-ownership after divorce. And I mean, even just saying that, I get anxiety because I can't imagine that is an easy thing to do, because if you're trying to actually get divorced from this person, now you're going to co-own a home. But Bobby, you talk me through it. And then what, scenarios, do people consider this?
Yeah, I kind of just threw this one in here because of the rules of three. It's nice to, have three things to talk about. It does happen, but it's my least favorite of all the options. It's not something I ever recommend, except if there's some extraordinary reason to do it. I mean, we're getting divorced. It's time to untangle ourselves, and things didn't work out. We weren't the best romantic partners together. We don't have the trust necessary. We don't have the communication necessary. What makes us think that we can actually own this huge asset together and figure out all of the nuances to, maintaining it, paying the mortgage, paying the taxes? It's a lot. So it's not something I usually recommend, unless maybe it's driven by market concerns, meaning the market's way down or the property is distressed or there's not a great way to get out of it right now, in that case, it might make sense for us to both own it. Or maybe the stability of the kids is so important. And that is, like I'll say a million times, a very compelling reason. So if we can figure out how to work together and make sacrifices for the kids, for them to be able to stay in this home, then by all means, figure it out. People do this, but it's precarious.
Yeah. I would imagine in this situation, there would be a lot of detail on who was responsible for what and what maybe percentage of things. I mean, is that pretty common? Because I would think that it would really need to be very black and white of the responsibilities of each person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we got to think about this like a business arrangement more than anything and make sure that we're going into it with kind of an operating agreement. What happens if somebody stops paying the mortgage? Then what do we do? And, this co-ownership idea it's common in a temporary way. We can do co-ownership quite often in a divorce if we want to give the other side the opportunity to stay in the house. So let's say that my spouse says, I want to stay in the house. It's really important to me. And I'm going to fight tooth and nail if you don't let me stay in this house. Well, I want to be practical. I want to move on with my life. I want to get this divorce done. So I talk to my lawyer and say, what are the options here? And I might tell my client, well, it looks like they can do this, but they're not going to be able to really practically refi for another 2 years. So let's give them a 2-year runway in order to get the refi done, get you off the mortgage. You're going to be making a sacrifice because for 2 years, you're probably not going to be able to get your own mortgage. But you're going to save yourself hugely in attorney's fees because you're just going to have an agreement that's done. And at least you have the finality and you know that in 2 years, they're either going to refi the house or they're going to have to sell it. A
question, it kind of makes me think again about like who's on the mortgage. Do you see this more commonly when both people are on the mortgage or if one person maybe is not on the mortgage but wants to stay in the home? Is that when you typically see this? Because it seems like it would be less common if you were the only one on the mortgage but to co-own, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're the only one on the mortgage but you're both on the deed, then it's simple enough for one person to, if you're not on the mortgage, then you can get off the deed relatively easily. If both of you are on the mortgage, then yeah, there might be some temporary co-ownership situation that makes sense to just get the deal done. I'm such a big fan of getting some sort of deal done so that you can move on. There's so much more opportunity, money, happiness, all of that in front of you than behind you at this point. One thing I will say though is, there are no perfect solutions here. And one thing that can happen is, that 2-year mark hits, they haven't been able to refi because of whatever reason. Either they've just not got around to it or financially they haven't been able to do it. And now you have to sell the house. If they're not willing to sell the house, if they're just refusing to go along with the agreement, you do have to go back into court and you have to litigate again. I mean, that's just the essence of untangling, is either we can all do it by cooperation and get it done, or we got to go back into court and litigate it. If they don't do it, though, if they violate the court order, there is a chance that you can get attorney's fees for having to go back and litigate.
Okay. That makes me want to just rip the Band-Aid, get it done, and not have the chance of having to do that again, Bobby.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Okay. Well, I got to say, personally, that's not my favorite choice, but here we are. It's an option for people out there. But my least favorite choice is the one we're getting ready to talk about. And you sort of started to allude to it, is when the court decides. So let's say an agreement cannot be reached on whether to sell, someone to stay, or to co-own the home. Now we're looking at the court deciding. So can you kind of tell us what that's going to look like and what the couple should expect?
Yeah, well, you might as well just sign the house over to the lawyers at this point, because that's pretty much what you're doing. I mean, not entirely, but litigation is just so expensive, and litigation is the process of letting the judge decide. People sometimes have this idea of like, oh, we'll just let the judge decide. Well,
Mhm.
the judge doesn't decide anything until the attorneys have gone through a very comprehensive, tedious exchange of financial information. They've done depositions. They sent out subpoenas. They've created, these extensive Excel spreadsheets of what evidence they have. They've prepared for trial. They've billed you a lot of money. A lot of months have passed. And then finally, the day has come where the judge is going to hear you testify, hear the other side testify, hear an appraiser testify, maybe two appraisers testify, a real estate agent testify. I mean, this is exhausting just talking about it, and it takes a long time, costs a lot of money, and it's really unpredictable. Then you don't even know what the judge is going to do, and it might not align with what's best for you, what's best for the kids, what's best for anybody.
Yeah. I mean, and as you're talking, I literally just see the equity, the potential equity you might have had in your home just walking away. I mean,
Yeah.
and for most people, that's going to be the biggest, nest egg that they have. That's their biggest investment, what they put the most money into. And if you're going to just spend all of that equity basically on paying attorney's fees, I mean, that just makes me really sad.
It makes me really sad too, and it's really frustrating to feel like I'm part of it sometime, and we do our best to try to help both sides be as practical as possible. We do our best to try to litigate in a very precise way so that we're just spending time on the things that are going to move the needle the most. But, litigation isn't pretty. It's not a very precise tool to use. So doing everything we can, using tools of, mediation, alternative dispute resolution, collaborative divorce. These are all terms that you should Google and learn about, because they're the ways that we get through a divorce without it turning into a bloodbath. Because having the court decide is not what you want to do.
Definitely not. And they don't even have to Google. They can just go through all the videos we've done because we've talked about a lot of these things.
Absolutely.
Well, okay, we've covered a lot today, Bobby. So why don't we sort of recap, when you are potentially trying to decide about a marital home, what the options are?
Sure. So the number one option, if it is a possibility, if it fits with the kids, is going to be sell the home. The number two option is one person keeps the home. That works best if the person wanting to keep the home is the only person on the mortgage. Otherwise, you got to go through a refi, cash out refi, changing interest rates, and all this other stuff. The third option is going to be a co-ownership of the real estate. Don't recommend that. Only do it if it's for a temporary purpose, if it's to get the deal done and there's a runway, an exit, a timeline. And then the fourth one is kind of the last one that we don't want to choose ever, and that is letting the judge decide.
Yes. Do not let the judge decide if you don't have to. Okay. So what are some of the key considerations that people should be thinking about when it comes to their marital home?
Spend money on a therapist rather than an attorney. Really walk through with your therapist all your, grieve with your mother and your father and your friends, and work through it emotionally and figure out why, it's so hard to let go through this, or let go of the house and get through this. I mean, I say this over and over because it's true. It's like we have these really strong emotional ties to these things that we associate with our marriage. Our identity is wrapped up with them. So if we can do work internally to move on, we can save ourselves so much heartache, both, in our real heart and in our wallet ache, if you will, in order to get through this process much easier.
Yeah, I love that advice, Bobby, because spending your money on therapy and healing, that helps you move on with your life and heal and start a new life. and be able to make some of those changes, which I love. I think it's really great. And now, obviously, it's a very emotional process. So what would be some final advice or encouragement for people that are trying to decide about, the marital home, whether to sell or whether to stay?
Just be patient with yourself. We don't need to figure this out today. You have been in this process for a while already. Probably you've been thinking about divorce. You've been knowing that your marriage isn't going to work out. So don't feel like you need the right answer today, but we do need to make progress. So just be patient with yourself. We're going to figure this out. It's going to be okay. There's going to be another chapter.
All right. Well, Bobby, thanks so much for being here with me today. I feel like this was a great conversation about the marital home. And if you are, considering divorce and trying to make these kind of decisions, we're grateful for having you here today, and we hope you learned something.
Thank you for listening to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast. We hope today's episode gave you clarity and support as you move forward on your journey. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Tune in next week for more insights and expert advice on the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast.